Hey everyone, it's Jacqueline for Pixie Dust PhD, and today we will be diving into the topic of a break-even point for your Disney Vacation Club contract purchase. There are literally hundreds of ways that you could calculate a break-even. Today we will be highlighting a handful. The idea is to get you oriented to how to think about a break-even point, as there are many perspectives you could take, and then you'll be off to the races with your own analysis. If you're considering buying a Disney Vacation Club contract and want to assess the monetary aspect of that, stay tuned. Before we get started, I do want to point out that the methods I've chosen to highlight today are intentionally simplistic. You can continue to add variables out the wazoo, but for the general YouTube audience that's interested in Disney Vacation Club, I think an analysis that's a bit more streamlined makes the most sense. And as always, we are surely oversimplifying things in the models we'll be using. I will do my best to point those out as we go along. It is important to note that all models are only as good as their assumptions, and really all models are flawed. The goal here really is to keep the math fairly high level in order to get everyone acquainted with this thought process. If you do find this helpful, please be sure to hit that thumbs up button to like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. You can ring that bell icon to receive notifications whenever I post new videos. For all scenarios, I'll be using my contract as an example. I purchased a 90-point contract on the resale market for a Bay Lake Tower home resort with an August use year at $146 per point. 90 points at $146 per point results in a purchase price of $13,410. I am ignoring the closing costs here that I paid. If you want to include those in your calculations, absolutely feel free. Let's start with a very simplistic model, comparing the cost of ownership to the cost of renting out Disney Vacation Club points. Prior to owning a Disney Vacation Club contract, I stayed in those villa accommodations at Walt Disney World by renting out points, and honestly, if I didn't own a DVC contract now, that would still be true. Let's assume it would cost me $20 a point to rent out points. If I needed my full contract's worth of points, those 90 points, that would be $1,800 to rent. Dividing my initial purchase price, that $13,500, by this total rental price, that $1,800, results in the break-even of about 7.5 trips. This does assume that the rental price would remain $20 a point indefinitely, which obviously isn't true, so there's your main flaw here. This math means that the amount I've spent to purchase that Disney Vacation Club contract would be spent in 7.5 trips worth of renting points. Any trips I get past that 7.5 break-even point are essentially free to me. They of course are not actually free because you do pay annual dues. But rather than continue to perpetually rent out points by buying this Disney Vacation Club contract after 8 trips or so, at least for the math for my contract, well, it's a better deal to own Disney Vacation Club. As a quick side note, we can use the exact same method, but rather than benchmarking to the rental price, let's benchmark to what Disney Vacation Club thinks their points are worth. Currently, if you are a DVC owner, you can purchase what are called one-time use points. Disney Vacation Club sells these right now for $19 per point. With the exact same logic and mathematical steps, we see that the break-even based on DVC's valuation is around 8 trips. Now, of course, you can't actually buy a full contract's worth of one-time use points. You are limited to a small amount per year. Currently, that's 24. But certainly benchmarking to what Disney Vacation Club thinks their points are worth is an interesting thought. Second, let's compare the cost of owning to the cost of staying in the exact same room type on that cash rate. In order to do this, you will need to model a specific room over specific dates. I'm utilizing the Mouse Savers data on room rates. I will leave a link to this in the description below. With my Disney Vacation Club Bay Lake Tower home resort contract, I'm imagining I am primarily staying in Standard View Studios. For dates, let's model my upcoming trip in the fall, which means early September timeframe. Looking at the cash rate for this room during that timeframe, we see there are actually 2 different rates. There's a cheaper rate for Sunday through Thursday nights, and then a more expensive rate for the weekend nights, Friday and Saturday. Taking the weighted average of these prices to get a general overall price per night, we see that roughly this room would cost me $622 per night. Now, let's say I'm planning on staying for 9 nights. You cannot actually get 9 nights at Bay Lake Tower on 90 points, but because my partner and I travel every other year to Walt Disney World, I have access to 2 years worth of points. But accordingly, adjust the length of your trip for what's realistic for you and your travel party. 9 nights at this average cash rate would cost around $5,600 total. Dividing that into my purchase price gives us a break-even of about 2.4 trips. Meaning, if I pay this cash rate for the room, after doing that trip less than 3 times, it would actually financially make more sense to have just bought that Disney Vacation Club contract. Again, here we are ignoring annual dues, and we're also assuming that the room rate is static in the future, which is not true. Surely it will go up. Worth noting, throughout most of these, I'll be emphasizing your break-even point as trips. If you go on trips multiple times a year, you will probably break even faster. If you're like me and you go a little bit less frequently every other year, well then you're going to hit your break-even point slower. 2.4 trips to break even for me is not 2.4 years, it's about double that because I only go every other year. But really, if you're going to pay the cash rate to stay at any Walt Disney World hotel, please don't pay the full rack rate. There are often various discounts available. Let's take a look at a 25% discount off that rack rate. We're going to use the exact same math and tools, but just take a 25% discount off that 9-night total. This would cost about $4,200 instead of nearly $5,600. Dividing this discounted total into our initial purchase price now gives us a break-even point of around 3.2 trips. Naturally, since this cash rate is cheaper than before, it's going to take us longer to break even. But honestly, 3.2 trips is still a relatively small amount. Say though you find a dynamite discount of 40%. Doing the exact same method, you come up with your break-even point being about 4 trips. Again, if you ask me, 4 trips seems like a pretty small amount and definitely makes DVC seem worth it. Realistically though, if I am not a Disney Vacation Club owner or I'm not renting points, I'm probably just not going to stay in a villa accommodation. Personally, I would be staying in a standard hotel room instead. The easiest comparator to a Bay Lake Tower studio would be a standard room over at the Contemporary. Again, we will use that Mouse Savers data and look up the time when we would be traveling. Then we can calculate an average nightly rate. This is definitely a bit cheaper than paying a cash rate for a deluxe studio. To continue comparing easily, we're going to stick with that 9-night stay. Calculating the total trip cost for a room at the Contemporary gets us in under $5,000. Doing the same math and comparing to our initial purchase price for that Disney Vacation Club contract, this would result in a break-even of only 2.8 trips. If you're generally staying at deluxe resorts and paying that full rack rate, which again I highly advise against, but if that is what you tend to do, well, you may end up being better off purchasing a Disney Vacation Club contract. Let's do the same thing where we look at room discounts though, because realistically, I genuinely hope you are not booking the full rate. A 25% discount at this room at the Contemporary gets us in around $3,500, which results in a break-even of about 3.73 trips. If you're able to snag a 40% discount on this room, the total trip cost then goes down to under $3,000. Your lower total trip cost means your break-even point is going to be higher. Here we are now at over 4.5 trips until you break even. Just for fun, let's go ahead and look at a moderate resort instead of a deluxe resort. We'll keep most of the variables the same. We're still going to plan a 9-night stay in early September, but now let's imagine we'd be staying at the Caribbean beach. Since the addition of the Skyliner, I think this is a pretty popular moderate resort. Staying at a moderate resort instead of a deluxe resort drops your total trip cost by quite a bit. Here at the Caribbean beach, we can get 9 nights at that full rack rate for under $3,000. This results in a break-even of about 4.8 trips. With a 25% discount on this room, you can get 9 nights here for just over $2,000. Now you're starting to spend a lot less on that hotel rate, so your break-even point is going to jump. Here we're now at almost 6.5 trips until you break even. And if you're able to snag a 40% off rate on this room, well then your break-even goes to over 8 trips. I am not an expert in hotel discounts at Disney World. My general impression is that 40% discounts for the general public, if you're not a cast member, particularly if you're not a Florida resident, are pretty rare, but I do think they exist. I am not aware if you can get a discount this high for anything lower than the deluxe category though. But on the off chance this is possible, I prefer to be fairly conservative with my math. Meaning, if I was the type of person that normally stayed at Caribbean Beach, I could look at this and say, well, even on the off chance that I could get a 40% discount off the rack rate, it would still only take me 8 trips to break even compared to this Disney Vacation Club contract. Realistically, you probably aren't getting 40% off this room every single time you go. So if you're spending more on your hotel, that actually means that the break even is going to go down. Being conservative with this math sets up lower expectations for when you would break even, and then if you break even faster than that, I feel like psychologically that's nice. To me, it's like when you go to the Cheesecake Factory and they tell you it will be a 30-minute wait and then you get seated in 15 minutes instead. Briefly, let's do the same at a different moderate resort. We'll pick Port Orleans French Quarter as a fan favorite. For the time frame that I'm looking at, the data indicates that Port Orleans French Quarter is also slightly cheaper than Caribbean Beach. This means that our break-even points will be a little bit higher. At the full price for Port Orleans French Quarter, you would need to take 5 trips to break even. If you're able to snag a great discount though, at 25% off that rack rate, you would need to take about 7 trips to break even, and at 40% off the rack rate, you'd need to take about 8.5 trips to break even. To complete the trifecta, let's compare to a value room. I've chosen a standard room at Pop Century, but absolutely adjust this to fit realistically where you think you would end up staying. Or even better, create your model based off where you have stayed in the past. Pop Century, on average during this time frame, is about $100 less per night than those moderate resorts that we looked at. 9 nights during this time frame comes in under $2,000, meaning the break-even point for my Disney Vacation Club contract at Bay Lake Tower is about 7.5 trips. If you could snag 25% off at Pop Century, then that break-even point goes up to almost 10 trips. And 40% would mean you need to take over 12 trips to break even. Anything over about 10 trips to break even, in my opinion, starts to get a little bit high. While certainly I think you can make this math work in your favor, even comparing to a value resort, if we're being honest, if you are comfortable staying at a value resort, Disney Vacation Club is probably not the best purchase for you. A DVC contract is a large sum of money upfront as well as yearly dues, and if you're happy staying at a value resort, this cost probably won't feel worth it to you. Moving on, let's look at renting out your points. Assume you are an owner and want to rent out your points. This is explicitly allowed in your contract, though you aren't supposed to be abusing it. Really, you shouldn't be buying a contract to consistently be renting out most of your points. The value comes in using your points for your vacations, in my opinion. But let's throw that logic aside and just look into it. My contract at Bay Lake Tower for 2021 has annual dues of $6.90 per point. Say when I'm renting out my points, I can sell them for $14 per point. To calculate a total potential profit, let's assume I'm selling all of my yearly points from the contract and then subtract out the annual dues that I have to pay. This leaves me with $639 in profit. Note that this math is ignoring any taxes that you may have to pay on these gains. Now, if we consistently rented out all of our points, which again, don't do that, but let's just say we did, it would take 21 years to break even with that initial purchase price. You absolutely can and should rent out your points if you won't be using them. It's better to rent them out than let them expire. But do not fully rely on renting out your points as a quality way to pay off your Disney Vacation Club purchase. Next, let's do a simple model that incorporates your annual dues. Again, my annual dues are currently $6.90 per point. Please adjust this for whatever home resort you're interested in. I purchased this contract for $146 per point. And let's assume that if I didn't own Disney Vacation Club and I did want to rent points, it would cost me $20 per point. But instead of renting, I do own a contract. This direct comparison of ownership to renting means that we're going to look at my initial purchase price divided by that amount it would take to rent minus our annual dues. When you rent points, you do not pay the annual dues. That is the full responsibility of the owner. But as a Disney Vacation Club owner, you then of course do pay those annual dues. Essentially, this overly simplistic model takes into the fact that by being an owner, you are paying annual dues. For the most part, prior models ignored annual dues. And worth noting, this model assumes that our annual dues remain static at $6.90 in perpetuity until the contract expires, which obviously is not true. They will be going up. But anyway, by taking these dues into account and assuming that if you were not an owner, you would be renting points in order to stay in these accommodations when you're going on your vacations to Disney, that gives you a break-even point of around 11 trips. Next, let's incorporate annual dues in a different way. First, we calculate how much our initial price per point will cost over the life of the contract per year. For me, this is just under $4 per year. Now, we already know the annual dues price. Again, we're falsely assuming this is going to be static moving in the future, but we can add the annual dues amount to our yearly per point amount that we just calculated. This gives me a total yearly cost per point of around $10.50. We don't actually have to do this next calculation to move on with the math and the model, but I think it's a fun aside. At about $10.50 per point per year, that means every year for my 90-point contract, I get those points for less than $1,000 per year. Now, you can't easily use that information to directly calculate a break-even point. If I used my 90 points every time I wanted a vacation at Walt Disney World, particularly if I did this yearly, I would be getting my accommodations covered for under $1,000. Considering the cost of Disney World hotels, that is some obvious savings. Back to the relevant math. Let's take that total yearly price that incorporates your annual dues and your initial per point purchase price and compare that to renting. Again, we are assuming renting would cost us $20 per point. The total savings you incur then on a yearly per point basis is just under 50%. This compares your total yearly cost, incorporating both your annual dues and that initial purchase price, to the price of renting. Rather than paying that price to rent, you have paid to own Disney Vacation Club and are saving a considerable amount compared to renting. Taking this percentage of savings compared to renting and extrapolating out, we can look at the lifetime of the contract. I have 39 years left on my contract as it expires in 2060, but again, adjust this for your preferred home resort. Savings of around 46% over 39 years means we save over 18 years. This makes the break-even point 39 years minus that 18-year saving, or almost 21 years. 21 years to break even doesn't sound great, but remember we're doing this as a percentage savings, so the logic slides with how long you think you'll keep the contract. For example, I love going to Disney now, but who knows what the future holds. In particular, I have a lot of medical issues, so if something bad happens in the future, I may need to sell my contract in order to pay off those fees. Also, depending on how my health progresses in the future, I may be more interested in chill vacations like going to the beach or sitting on a cruise rather than the hustle of theme parks. Hopefully that's a long way off or it never happens, but you just really never know. Let's say instead of imagining that I will use this contract for the full 39 years, that I'm planning to keep it for 20. Then you can see that the break-even scales because we're multiplying a percentage. Our break-even point would be about 10.5 years into that 20 years we'd imagine keeping the contract. This essentially means that compared to renting, the cost of your Disney Vacation Club contract pays for itself in about 10.5 years, and all the vacations you take after that are a bonus. Before we wrap up, I definitely want to cover a couple of things that are not a break-even calculation per se, but definitely play into this conversation. First, you can calculate an annualized initial cost instead of a break-even. The simplest way to do this is to take your initial purchase price and then divide it by the remaining contract years you have left. For my contract, there's 39 years left, and at my purchase price, this results in an annualized initial cost of under $350 per year. This only takes into the account of your initial purchase price, so you would have to add on annual dues on top of that. That being said, for me, I absolutely think that cost is worth the promise of deluxe accommodations in Walt Disney World. Also, if you don't plan on keeping that contract for its full length, then of course your annualized initial cost increases per year. But y'all are smart and you can figure that out. Just replace that time left on the contract, for me 39 years, with the time you think you'll have the contract, say 20 years instead. Next, there's opportunity cost. Here I am showing you the last 10 years performance of the S&P 500. From this last 10 years, the average growth rate has been about 13.5%. But note, that is without fees. In general, and this is a vast oversimplification, but since the Great Depression for the S&P 500, you can count on about 8 to 10% growth. As with all things in the stock market though, this is not guaranteed. You can see here there certainly are years that are negative, meaning there is no growth, you are actually losing value. Investing, in the long run and looking with a very wide lens, is generally always going to gain you money. It will gain value over time. But when you zoom into shorter time frames, there absolutely can be losses, and in terms of investing, 1 year can be considered short, absolutely. Anyway, buying a Disney Vacation Club contract definitely comes with opportunity cost. You could be using that money for a myriad of other things, a car, a down payment on the house, or you could invest it. Let's assume you instead invest that money into the S&P 500. For my initial purchase price of over $13,000, had I put it into the S&P 500 and waited a year, and we assume it's growing at that rough rate of 13.5%, this would now be about $15,000. Next, let's look at what your money could grow to if you take that money, invest it, and then leave it alone for the length of your proposed Disney Vacation Club contract. For me, at this S&P 500 growth rate of about 13.5% from the last decade, we would have grown my initial about $13,000 into almost $2 million over that 39 years. If we used a growth rate of 8% instead of that 13.5%, we would have grown only to about $250,000, but that still is quite a lot of money. Again, year to year, it's going to vary a lot, and this is a gross oversimplification. The overarching point really is that if you're investing money and it's compounding annually, it can grow quite a lot over time. However, this does assume that you're investing money and then never taking any of it out. In this model, we're assuming the full amount is compounding every year for 39 years. Certainly for me, this is unlikely. If you have disposable income, I do think it is very important that you are investing for your future. At the same time, I think some amount of money should be spent. What is the point of having money if it's just all going to sit in an account that you never touch? Everyone has different risk tolerances and comfort levels, but you have to find a balance of investing money and saving for your future, but making sure that you're still enjoying your life right now. Generally speaking though, I think this scenario for me is unlikely. If I'm putting over $10,000 into an investment, there's a high chance that I am slowly siphoning some amount of money off of that amount to pay for things like vacation. But this is a very stark example of the potential that your money has to grow into if you invest it instead of doing something like buying Disney Vacation Club. This is not a nuanced discussion, but I just wanted to highlight that it is relevant to consider your opportunity costs. Overall, I think it's important to emphasize that buying a timeshare, including Disney Vacation Club, is not always 100% about the money. For me, it's actually probably mostly not about the money. Timeshares to me are more about the fact that I am promising myself regular vacations. Of course, it's somewhat about the money. You do have to be able to afford the purchase in the first place. But after all of that and all of these calculations about monetarily is it worth it or not, some of this comes down to philosophy. What do you value? I do value going to Walt Disney World, and locking that in with a timeshare has value on its own. There just is also this financial bonus and upside that the math generally works out in my favor. Finally, don't forget about Disney math. Sure, a Disney Vacation Club contract very legitimately has real potential to save you money over time on your hotel accommodations. This is especially true if you're comparing DVC ownership to paying a cash rate at a Walt Disney World hotel. That being said, are you going to get lured in? Will you change the way and the frequency with which you vacation to Disney once you become a DVC member? Because going more frequently to the theme parks, even if you are able to pay for your accommodations with those vacation points, is going to result in more money being spent at Disney. You will surely have higher yearly costs for food while you're at Disney, transportation down there, and maybe transportation while you're there if you're the type of person that rents a car, and as well as your tickets. This may even convert you to a person that starts to buy annual passes, and then you feel pressure to renew it every year, even though previously, before buying Disney Vacation Club, you never bought annual passes. There's also the possibility of increased purchases of merchandise and souvenirs from your increased visits. Disney definitely wants you on property more, and once you are, they assume you'll be spending more money to them, and they're probably right. If owning Disney Vacation Club would change the way you're vacationing and how much you're spending, it is important to consider that. The models we've talked about today have been super simplistic and haven't incorporated any of these factors. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. We can also chat outside of YouTube over on Twitter and Instagram at PixieDustPhD. I do again want to emphasize that the models I've presented in this video were extremely simplistic. They were all quite scaled down and absolutely flawed. We ignored inflation, for example, in basically every example when considering the cost of hotels, the cost of annual dues, the cost of renting Disney Vacation Club points, and more. There are also other costs that you could choose to factor into your models that I purposely ignored for simplicity. For example, some folks like to factor in the cost of food and tickets. We did incorporate a couple of discounts into a few of these models, but there are plenty more discounts that you could explore. Overall, after this video, I hope you feel like you have a solid foundation when it comes to thinking about break-even point calculations. My goal is that you now feel empowered to go forth and add however many variables you see fit. And truly last, we really didn't touch on economics basically at all today. I do think it's key to point out though that money today is not the same as money tomorrow, and frankly, $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow. Be bold with your calculations, but keep the time value of money in mind. Thanks so much for everyone who did leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel. I hope the rest of your day is absolutely magical, and we'll see you real soon at Pixie Dust PhD.